people related to their human rights impact through international, domestic, and transnational processes. Dr. Bernaz?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to be in Armenia. I had a tour this morning of the memorial, and it was very moving to be there. I also want to say that I'm a French citizen, and I talked to my mom this morning and I said I was going to give this presentation, but I got the feeling that the highlight of her day was really Aznavour's funeral and not my talk, so thank you for being here. So my field of research is business and human rights, and the main question in this field is how to enhance the accountability of the business sector for their human rights impact. So that means looking at various things like human rights consequences of pollution, but also things like displacement of population for big projects like dams or building World Cup football stadiums. But also it means looking at complicity of the private sector in the commission of international crimes, and also the human rights impact of corruption and so-called white-collar crimes. So today I will discuss past and current examples of transitional justice processes that have tried to deal with corporate accountability, and I will highlight what I hope are opportunities but also challenges in this area. Let me start with a few general points. The first one is that while I will talk about accountability of corporations, what I'm really talking about is accountability of the private sector, and that means corporations, but that also means individual business people, usually businessmen, but let's just use business people to be inclusive in a transitional context. So this is not just about corporations, this is also about individuals. Secondly, another general point in this area is that corporations rarely have impacts on human rights without the involvement of the state. So when discussing accountability mechanisms for corporations, one recurrent issue is how to account for behavior that actually involves the state and the private sector. And sometimes it is difficult from a legal perspective to untangle those issues and to assign responsibility where it needs to be assigned. So that's just something to bear in mind. A related issue is that in many transitional justice scenarios, the public and the private sectors overlap considerably. Some business ventures involve state-owned companies. Prominent business people may also at some point hold public office, and especially in smaller countries, political and business elites are hard to distinguish and tend to operate sort of in the same circles. So something also to bear in mind. So my talk today is divided into two parts. The first part will look at past transitional justice efforts to hold corporations or business people to account for their participation to international crimes as well as corruption or economic crimes. And then the second part will be smaller but also more forward-looking, and I will look at current efforts internationally to enhance corporate accountability for their human rights impacts. And what I want to do is try to explain how those current efforts relate to transitional justice and what opportunities lie there in this relationship between corporate accountability and transitional justice. So it's usually said that transitional justice has four components: justice, truth, reparations, and institutional reform. And we've talked about all of that already. Let me start with the justice component. The justice component usually means prosecutions at the domestic or the international level. So a few points here of importance if you start talking about corporate accountability and the justice system. First of all, internationally, the International Criminal Court, despite efforts from some countries, including my own, France, during the negotiations of the statute, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over corporations. It only has jurisdiction over individuals. So those individuals, of course, in theory, can be business people. So in theory, there is space at the International Criminal Court for the prosecution of the crimes committed by the private sector, let's say. But as we know, the International Criminal Court only focuses on very specific atrocity crimes with very narrow definitions, and of course there are sets of conditions. So it is very limited. To talk specifically about the justice component, in every transitional justice scenario, as was mentioned already, choices need to be made about who to prosecute. And sometimes to move on, or to be pragmatic about it, only the head, only the leaders are prosecuted. And this is particularly important when looking at corporate accountability, because the private sector, and that was the crux of your question to Marika earlier, the private sector is often seen as a crucial partner to allow the country to move on. The skills, the money, the connections, the knowledge, the know-how, how to do business, how to make money, how to create development and opportunities, all of that, of course, is very important to either maintain an economy or rebuild an economy in transitional justice scenarios where there's really countries are completely destroyed. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that it is likely to be counterproductive to say, okay, let's just remove everyone. Let's just get rid of them all, because there's always this discussion about we need those people, we need those skills, because if everyone goes, then we'll be alone, and it will be very difficult to maintain a position on the world stage. So this is a complex and delicate issue, and it's very hard to strike a balance. Few examples of prosecution of corporate officials in transitional context, but those are very limited. For example, in Argentina, a large number of the victims of the dictatorship who were tortured, executed, and disappeared were trade union leaders. Many of those victims were part of that group of people from trade unions. So with that in mind, some corporate officials at companies such as Mercedes-Benz, for example, were prosecuted in relation to the treatment of those union leaders. But this is, of course, very specific, and for widespread, systematic, and more diffuse issues such as corruption, it is hard, in my opinion, it is very hard, and also it's been shown in previous examples that it's hard to rely solely on prosecutions because of the standard of proof that needs to be upheld in criminal prosecutions, and also because of limited resources. I mean, everyone who's had here in this room any experience in the justice system, you will know that to prosecute someone and to do it right, it costs money. There's no way around it. It takes time. You need to allow people some time to defend themselves, etc. And this just takes a lot of resources. The tendency, therefore, in prosecutions is to focus on just a few selected prosecutions, but this really is very difficult to do across the board for issues that are as widespread and diffuse as corruption. So partly for that reason, when it comes to corporate accountability, the emphasis in transitional justice has been put more on the truth component rather than on the prosecution component. Truth can emerge out of prosecutions. This is not just in truth commissions that truth can emerge. But mostly what I want to talk about here is truth commissions, and of course we've heard about some of them already. And a few of those truth commissions in the past have dealt with corporate accountability in more or less details. Interestingly, the South African Truth Commission held meetings for 2.5 years, and famously only 3 days out of these 2.5 years were devoted to public hearings on the role of the business sector in the apartheid era. And those hearings led to a lot of frustrations. And by and large, corporations and corporate officials who appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all of them, of course, part of the white business elite, presented themselves as victims of the regime, with the argument that the apartheid regime had made South Africa a pariah on the world stage because of the sanctions, etc. And then, in fact, they were victims of that because that kind of limited their business opportunities. So it was a bit of a reversal. And once you give people the floor to speak publicly, you cannot control what they're going to say. So that kind of was generally seen as not a particularly positive experience when it came to giving the floor to those business leaders to hear what they had to say. Nevertheless, in this final report, which I think is of importance here, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa distinguished between 3 levels of responsibility for the business sector. And they said, first of all, we have companies with what they call first order involvement. And those were mostly the mining companies in South Africa, because those were the companies who helped the government design and implement the apartheid policies. So really those heavily involved. Then we had companies with second order involvements, and those were the people who knew their products and services were going to be used for morally unacceptable purposes. For example, companies providing armament, like light armed vehicles who were used in anti-riot. And then the third, and this is where it becomes interesting, I think, in terms of the truth element, the third categories of companies were companies with third order involvement, and those were those who benefited indirectly from the repressive regime, strictly because they operated in a context that allowed them to prosper and to make money in a way that they would not have been allowed to prosper in a different environment, which I think is closer to a sort of more diffuse, perhaps corruption mechanism than any of the other categories. Also, something that has been pointed out earlier, truth commissions play an important role in telling a story and in sort of shaping a public narrative over a particular set of issues. So they tell a story about what happened. And I think it's particularly, though there is discussion, I think, in scholarship about whether corruption can be included in that, but I do think that if it cannot be addressed there, I wonder where exactly it could be addressed, and I think we could discuss that later on. But particularly for these kind of issues that are diffuse and there's so many people involved, and you know, perhaps the way to do it is to put it on the table in a truth commission. Then there's the reparations component, and we've talked about this already, and Professor Shavers said, well, maybe just ask people to give the money back. And that, of course, was very much discussed in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there were different proposals to try to, you know, for want of a better word, make the corporations pay and get money out of them. So a wealth tax was proposed, some other extra taxation on corporate benefits were also suggested. In the end, a business trust was established with contributions from the private sector. They were made to pay into a trust fund. So I haven't looked at this in great detail, I must say, but the little that I've read about it was that it's generally thought that the amount was not enough. And there were also, unfortunately, allegations of misuse of this money, which, you know, is not helping. But I think there's perhaps a bit of a lesson here that as soon as money is involved in giving back some money, there's always the potential for mismanagement. Some of the things that could be explored in that context is reparations in nature, rather than reparation in money. So, for example, things like restitution of land that was taken away, things like forbidding certain companies or certain individuals to bid for public money ever again. Again, something future-looking. You stole money in the past. Maybe we'll forget that, but you're not going to do it anymore. You have to retire, stop doing what you're doing, and you won't be able to go for public money ever again. Is one of the things that has been looked at in the past. Also, terminating contracts, terminating public contracts that were made with companies that played a role or were identified as criminal or corrupt is also one way to do this without going into a full-fledged prosecution or truth commission scenario. And then in transitional justice, there's this institutional reform component. Now in corporate accountability, that doesn't sit, of course, very well, because by definition we're talking about the private sector, whereas institution reform is institutions, public institutions. I've looked at some examples of transitional mechanisms that have touched upon corporate accountability. I should mention, I didn't want to start with that, but I'll mention it here, that there are some debates over whether corporate accountability should even be included in transitional justice mechanisms. And some argue that transitional justice should only be for the, let's say, the big fish, the political leaders, people who held positions of power in the state, and that corporations, we can just forget about it and let it go, because more often than not, these individuals were not leaders, but were more profiteering from a system that allowed them to thrive. I would actually question that idea that transitional justice is only about the head. I think there's value in this, but I think experience, now that we've looked back at 25 years, I think experience has proven that you don't change a country by just eliminating the head. And I think if any examples from the Middle East can be taken, Libya and Iraq are just, glaring example that this is not solving much to get rid of people, no matter how atrocious their crimes may have been. So I personally think, having looked at corporate accountability for some time now, that it's not a distraction to look at those issues in a transitional context. I think it's essential, especially in countries where there's a close proximity between business leaders and political leaders, and this is not a side issue. This is a central issue, and this is what people think about as well in transition. What are the risks? Are we going to be seen as not business friendly and not attracting foreign investment anymore? And those questions are real, but I think if you just avoid that question, that's not really solving anything in the long run. Just to talk about the current international legal framework on corporate accountability and the opportunities that lie there, I think, to relate that to transitional justice mechanisms. So we have, in 2011, some new standards on corporate accountability that have been adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And what I'm talking about here are the guiding principles on business and human rights. And what's been happening is that a lot of countries have taken those principles and adopted national action plans to implement those principles, to see what it looks like to enhance corporate accountability at the domestic level. So many countries have national action plans, the UK, the Netherlands, and in the region here, Georgia also recently adopted one. They adopted one in March this year. And what is very interesting in those national action plans is that they're very different from one country to another. There's really not one way of doing it. And some of them have addressed specifically corruption as a particular issue of concern in terms of the human rights impact of corporations. And one country in particular, Colombia, has recently gone through a massive transition with a huge, extremely ambitious peace agreement between the government and the revolutionary forces. And interestingly, their national action plan on business and human rights and the peace agreement are closely interlinked. They were negotiated at the same time. And the peace agreement makes space for the private sector accountability, but also role in moving forward, recognizing that they have the money, they have the skills, and you cannot just completely get rid of them if you want to move on and continue to exist on the world stage, let's just say. So in terms of the potential there, I think that those plans are really a versatile tool, and they shouldn't be ignored in a transitional justice discussion. I think that it could be helpful to look at that as one of the tools in the transitions, if there is indeed a will to look at white-collar crime and corruption, and to deal with that seriously. So thank you.